So now that we have a solid understanding of the structure of individual atoms, we can start connecting atoms together to form compounds. So this unit is going to be all about chemical bonding, the different types of bonds that can form, how they form, why they form, and how that leads to the structures of different types of chemical compounds. So first thing we need to get our minds around is just the basics of chemical bonding itself. So in the most general terms, bonds form between atoms in order to make those atoms more stable, or in order to become more stable. So generally speaking, anything that just kind of happens on its own in chemistry is making things more stable in some way, shape, or form. That is like the driving force behind chemical reactions. So in order for, if start that sentence over again. If forming a bond will make both of those atoms more stable, that bond is likely to form. If it will not make those atoms more stable, that bond is probably not going to form. We might be able to make it form, but it's not going to be happy about it. So keeping this idea in mind that bonds form to make things more stable is really important. And a consequence of this is that forming new bonds always releases energy. So if something is becoming more stable when a bond forms, more stable means that that thing is lower in energy. So if it's becoming more stable, it's starting at a higher energy, it's ending up at a lower energy. It means that energy has to go somewhere, and it's going to be released from those atoms to whatever else is around, other atoms of some sort, or other objects nearby. So forming bonds always releases energy. Consequently, going in the other direction, if we are breaking bonds, that always requires an input of energy. When a bond is formed, those two atoms are attracted to one another. So in order to pull them apart, you can think of them kind of like magnets, that if you've got two magnets that are stuck together, in order to separate them, you have to pull. You putting in that effort to pull is putting in energy to separate those two things that are attracted to one another. And the same is true of bonds. To pull two bonded atoms apart, you've got to put energy in to actually separate them, to yank them apart from one another. So these ideas are true of all bonds, regardless of type. But there are two main types of bonds that we're going to be talking about in this unit. Depending on what types of elements are involved, you tend to get one or the other. So the first one is ionic bonding. And in ionic bonds, or when an ionic bond forms, electrons are completely transferred from one atom to another. Which creates ions if one atom is losing and the other atom is gaining. If they're starting out neutral, that transfer of electrons creates a cation and an anion, and then opposites attract. So this creates ions, which are then attracted to one another. And that attractive force is the ionic bond. So when we're referring to an ionic bond, we're talking about the attraction between the cation and an anion. So let's actually stick that in, be a little bit more specific. So that attraction between cation and anion is what we really mean when we say an ionic bond. So this type of bonding generally occurs between a metal, which would be the cation, and a nonmetal, which would be the anion. So you'll notice if you think back to what we've talked about metals versus nonmetals and things forming charges on the periodic table, it just so happens that all of the things that tend to form positive charges are metals, all of the things that happen to form negative charges are nonmetals. So this idea of a metal with a nonmetal pairing up to create an ionic compound should kind of flow logically from what we've talked about so far. The other type of bonding that we're really going to focus most of this unit on, we will talk a little bit more about ionic, but is covalent bonding. So in covalent bonding, electrons are not completely transferred. Electrons are shared between two atoms. So we'll get into a lot more of the details about how that happens in future lessons. For now, just recognizing the difference between ionic and covalent is good enough. And these usually occur just between nonmetals. So as we know from the periodic table, the nonmetals are kind of in the upper right-hand corner. So they're really a kind of small subset of elements, but there's actually a staggering variety of ways that they can bond and compounds that they can form. So we'll be talking a lot more about that in future lessons. So for today, recognizing ionic is a complete transfer of electrons, which is what's creating these ions. So we'll always have one cation, which tends to be a metal, and one anion, which tends to be a nonmetal, pairing up together to create an ionic compound via an ionic bond. Covalent compounds share electrons instead, so both electrons still have access to the electrons that are being shared between them. And this tends to occur just between all nonmetals in the formula.